Welcome to Hidden Black History. Tonight we open a file that was never meant to be read, a fragment of iron found in the dust of a forgotten archive, a few carved words that refuse to stay silent. This is the story of the man who forged rebellion from the same metal that bound him. The blacksmith who defied his chains. Virginia, 1800, the rebellion, they hid. They say history remembers the victors, but some stories refuse obedience. They survive in smoke and rust and the faint ringing of a hammer that hasn't struck for 200 years. This is one of them, a record too dangerous to be called history and too stubborn to die. It began with a folded piece of iron shaped like a letter stored for more than a century in a wooden crate marked miscellaneous ironwork. When a WPA field researcher lifted it in 1937, the scratches caught the light. They weren't random. They were words carved by hand, burned by time. We forged their chains, but we learned the heat remembers our hands. No name, no date. Only that sentence etched deep enough to outlast the man who made it. Whoever he was, he had written his truth in the hardest language he knew, metal. The official records mention a disturbance near Deep Run Creek, Henrico County. Enslaved artisans suspected of gathering at night. No arrests, no trial, no verdict. Only a forge burned to the ground before dawn. 3 enslaved blacksmiths disappeared from plantation ledgers that same month. Not sold, not deceased, simply gone. And in the parish log, a single line written in haste: smithy burned by night. Fire spoke louder than tongues. A century later, a man named Elijah Tinsley told a WPA interviewer that his grandfather still remembered the sound. They said the hammer struck 12 times, he whispered, and the last one sounded like thunder. No one could prove there was ever a man named Elias. No ledger carried his name, but his story lived in song. Work chants hummed in fields, melodies that hid messages inside rhythm. Elias, they sang soft as breath. Fire don't die when the maker gone. In those songs, Elias wasn't just a man, he was the forge itself. The heat, the will, the defiance that refused to cool. Some say he became the metal. Others say he was consumed by it. Either way, he left the world a message that even iron remembers its maker. Weather records show no rain that night, though the militia blamed rainfall for extinguishing the blaze. Lies leave their own kind of smoke. The truth, like fire, always leaves a scent. Historians later called it a localized disturbance. The descendants called it a cleansing. The night the fire spoke. The night the metal remembered. Every March, families across Virginia still leave a nail by their doors. Not for luck, but for memory. They say if you heat it in the flame, it sings the hiss of a hammer that never stopped. 2 centuries later, the carved iron sits behind glass in an archive drawer, silent but not cold. Some researchers say the metal hums faintly when the room is quiet, as if carrying a pulse. Perhaps it's just the air conditioning, perhaps not. What remains are fragments, a letter of iron, a burned forge, a line in a parish log, and a song passed down in whispers. Between them, something unbroken survives. The record ends where folklore begins, and together they form a truth too heavy for paper. This is not a legend. It's a wound that glows when you look too closely. The rebellion they hid began with silence and ended with fire. By the year 1800, Virginia stood on the edge of transformation and terror. Tobacco had drained the land, but slavery had not loosened its hold. Plantations spread across the Tidewater counties like scars, and among them the blacksmith was both indispensable and dangerous. His hands could shape tools, build hinges, mend weapons, and if he chose, he could shape freedom too. That was what made him valuable and feared. Blacksmiths held knowledge that no overseer could fully control. They carried skill, fire, and muscle, a combination the state began to view with suspicion. In Henrico County alone, records list more than 40 enslaved smiths spread among 15 plantations. Their work fed the economy, yet their strength frightened it. They labored close to heat, close to sparks, close to the idea of rebellion itself. In early 1800, the Virginia Assembly was already restless. Whispers of unrest had rippled through Richmond and Petersburg. There were rumors of letters passed between plantations, of coded hymns, of a secret plan among artisans and preachers. In that same season, a man named Gabriel, a skilled blacksmith from nearby Brookfield Plantation, was said to have begun organizing a rising one that would strike the city itself. History would later call it Gabriel's Rebellion, though it was crushed before it began. Yet in its shadow, many smaller fires burned, unseen pockets of defiance, brief and bright, then smothered by fear. The forge near Deep Run Creek may have been one of them. The reports are too thin to prove, too loud to ignore. Militia documents from August 1800 describe restlessness among bonded laborers and increased surveillance of black artisans. That same month, new slave codes were issued prohibiting enslaved people from hiring themselves out or gathering without written permission. The timing was no coincidence. Every hammer had become suspect. Every ring of metal could be mistaken for a call to arms. A plantation ledger belonging to the Hollins family mentions the disappearance of 3 workmen from the smithy believed runaway. No reward poster was printed, no pursuit recorded. In contrast, the county's parish log notes a fire at a forge 3 miles away, no deaths, no explanation. The handwriting trails off mid-sentence as if the clerk thought better of continuing. For historians, such omissions speak louder than records. Silence has weight. When every other detail of a plantation's operation is carefully itemized, the tools, the rations, the days of rain, and one night simply vanishes. That void demands attention. Something happened. Something too large or too forbidden to be written. Meanwhile, folklore was doing what archives would not. In oral stories gathered more than a century later, the people remembered a smith of the river Bend, a man whose forge burned blue and whose hammer woke the earth. They said his name was Elias or Eli, or sometimes just the Maker. He was the one who refused, the one who turned the heat against the chains. In the Works Progress Administration field notes, the interviewer underlined a phrase spoken by an elder woman in Richmond. "You can't chain a man who makes the chains." It was both proverb and prophecy. She said her grandmother heard it the week before the Great Fire of 1800, and the family believed it was a warning not from God, but from those who worked in the dark. Between documented history and remembered legend lies a shared heartbeat. The facts speak of missing men, revised laws, and sudden fires. The folklore fills in the rest songs about hands too strong for shackles, about heat that won't cool, about ghosts who still work the anvil when the moon is high. Both layers tell the same truth, that creation and destruction are born from the same flame. For enslaved blacksmiths, the forge was a contradiction. It was the source of their bondage and their power. To shape iron was to serve the system. To master the fire was to glimpse freedom. The overseers could command their labor, but not their rhythm. The song of hammer and spark belonged only to them. Elias, if that was his name, would have known this better than anyone. He would have felt the pulse of rebellion in every strike. He would have known that to heat iron is to risk its breaking, and that every chain carries the memory of its making. If he chose to stop forging, that single refusal could have been an act louder than any shout. Slave codes treated refusal as defiance, defiance as conspiracy. To refuse to work the forge could be read as revolt, and revolt even imagined was punished by death. So the story of Elias, if true, could never have survived in writing. It could only live where paper could not reach, in song, in whispers, in the breath between generations. After Gabriel's rebellion was crushed that autumn, the state tightened its grip. Yet even as they built new laws, the overseers could not quiet the wind that carried stories of the blue fire. They may have thought the forge was destroyed, but the memory smoldered beneath the soil. Every rumor became a kind of protection, a way to keep the dead alive, a way to warn the living. By the time Reconstruction began 6 decades later, the legend had changed form. Now the blacksmith was said to have melted his chains into tools or hammered his way into the earth. Some believed his ghost guarded the crossroads where the forge once stood. Others said the river turned dark on the anniversary of his disappearance. Whether metaphor or memory, these details are never random. Folklore remembers what record keepers omit. Even in the 20th century, descendants of enslaved smiths in Virginia would speak of a hum beneath certain patches of ground. WPA field notes mention locals who refused to build near the site of the old forge. "Soil too hot," one man said. "Spirit won't rest." Context then is not just about time or place, it's about the atmosphere of fear and memory that shaped both. In Virginia, 1800 was not a year but a wound. The rebellion they hid was not one event but a pattern, men who labored, then vanished, leaving behind nothing but the echo of heat. To tell this story is to accept the limits of proof, to see history not as what was written but what was erased. The blacksmith's forge becomes a lens through which we glimpse both worlds, the official and the unseen. It is where fact begins to glow and folklore cools into truth. The first surviving document connected to this story is dated August 3, 1800, a thin, almost brittle page preserved in the Henrico County archives. It reads like a fragment of routine bureaucracy unrest reported among smiths on the River Road, suspect gatherings in evening hours, ordered to restrict fire usage after sundown. The handwriting is precise, almost indifferent, but between the lines there is tension, the kind that comes when a community begins to fear its own laborers. The blacksmiths were being watched not because they were violent, but because they were capable. Another letter written by a plantation overseer named Isaac Hollins appears in a family journal housed at the Library of Virginia. He complains that his forge workers speak in murmurs and strike rhythm where none is needed. That phrase, strike rhythm where none is needed, recurs in several neighboring reports almost word for word. To an outsider, it might sound trivial. To those who understood, it was code. A rhythm, a pattern, a message traveling by sound when speech was forbidden. In slaveholding Virginia, the hammer itself was suspect. Overseers learned to count the beats to notice when work songs grew too intentional. To them, rhythm was rebellion disguised as routine. The same heat that built their plows could melt their order. The more the smiths sang, the tighter the laws became. By September, local ordinances banned unsupervised forges. Fire-like literacy was considered too powerful for the enslaved to hold without oversight. And yet, in the absence of written permission, another kind of language emerged. The folklore collected by WPA interviewers a century later speaks of the 12 strikes, a pattern of 12 hammer blows meant to signal a call. It appears in multiple counties: Henrico, Goochland, Chesterfield. Each community believed it marked the night a forge burned blue. The tale shifts with every telling. Sometimes Elias is alone, sometimes he stands among apprentices, but the core never changes. The forge glows, the chains crack, and then there is silence. In the WPA transcripts, an elderly woman named Rose Carter said, "They said the hammer talked. Every ring was a word. When you knew how to listen, you could hear the promise in it." She was the granddaughter of a smith. She claimed her family still used an old rhythm to test the heat: 6 slow, 6 fast. When asked where it came from, she smiled and said, "From the man who made the fire sing." Folklore preserves emotion that the archives refuse to record. Where official letters speak of unrest, the people remember awakening. Where documents call it sabotage, the elders call it cleansing. The difference is not just language, it is ownership. The same event split by class and skin becomes two histories staring at each other through smoke. In the plantation journals of 1800, there is a pattern of sudden silence, pages where entries skip as though days never happened. An overseer lists every nail, every plow, every animal, and then nothing. No explanation, just white space. For the enslaved, that absence was memory. For historians, it is proof of fear. In systems built on control, omission is the loudest confession. Fact tells us that a law was passed in October restricting enslaved artisans from handling combustible material without supervision. Folklore tells us that the fire could no longer be trusted to stay loyal. It burns where it pleases now, an old man told the WPA collector, laughing without joy. Once you teach fire how to sing, it don't go back to whispering. Every rebellion leaves behind 2 trails, one for the record and one for the heart. In the official trail, names vanish. In the other, they multiply. The people didn't say Elias once they said it until it became many. The smith, the forger, the singer, the one who taught heat how to remember. At the Library of Congress, one field recording from 1938 contains a low rhythmic chant believed to be descended from that forge song. No words are decipherable, only the pattern of metal meeting. Metal slowed and repeated. It ends abruptly as though interrupted. The archivist's note reads, "Sound resembles hammer-striking anvil tempo, deliberate tone, mournful. It may not prove anything, but it feels like everything." Across both layers, the question remains, what exactly happened on that night in 1800? The documents refuse to tell. The folklore refuses to stop. One speaks with ink, the other with breath. Together, they build a memory stronger than either could alone, the kind of truth that survives precisely because no one was allowed to write it. In the academic sense, this period marks the point where fact begins to bleed into faith. The fire becomes a language. The forge becomes an altar. The blacksmith, nameless yet eternal, becomes both craftsman and prophet, a man whose silence outlasted the empire that tried to own him. And so, between the records and the songs, a shape emerges, not of a single rebellion, but of resistance itself, folded and reheated, generation after generation. The chain was only ever part of the story. The heat was the rest. The more the records tighten, the louder the silences grow. Each month of 1800 leaves another empty space, another half-written report. The militia writes that the situation is contained. The church records note unusual gatherings after dark. But the folk songs collected a century later tell a different story of footsteps moving in rhythm of tools hidden beneath hay of a forge that burned not to destroy but to summon. One voice says the fire ended rebellion. The other says the fire began it. Between them lies the truth neither dared to write. A letter from Colonel James Tabb to the Virginia Council warns that certain black tradesmen have exhibited signs of spiritual confusion. The phrase strange and vague reappears in multiple counties that same summer. Spiritual confusion. It was code for the fear that enslaved workers were turning worship into organization. The men who led songs at the forge were no longer seen as artisans, they were seen as preachers. Every hymn about deliverance carried the weight of insurrection, and so faith itself became suspect, the sound of prayer mistaken for the rhythm of revolt. Meanwhile, the overseers' journals grow nervous. They record the same detail again and again: lights near the tree line, hammering after dusk, voices not belonging to this quarter. In isolation, these notes mean little. Together they pulse with dread. It's as if every plantation heard the same distant heartbeat, a sound they could not locate, but could not silence either. Perhaps it was the echo of labor. Perhaps it was the echo of something older. Fact insists that the authorities acted quickly. A militia patrol was dispatched to Deep Run Creek on the night of August 29th. They found the forge still warm but empty. One report claims the anvil glowed faintly as if recently struck. Another says the ashes refused to cool. Those details, dismissed by scholars as superstition, survive only because the clerk who wrote them couldn't quite bring himself to erase what he'd seen. Bureaucracy bends in moments like this. The pen hesitates. The human eye betrays the system that trained it. From the oral tradition, the story unfolds differently. They say Elias had gathered others, smiths, coopers, carpenters, men who knew how to build and how to break. They didn't plan to flee. They planned to unmake. If we built the cage, one voice recalls, we can build the key. The hammering that night wasn't labor, it was signal. 12 strikes slow and certain, a pulse that traveled down the valley until it reached men too tired to dream. Some came running, others prayed. All remembered the sound. But no insurrection followed. No uprising broke the plantations. The rebellion, if it existed, was spiritual, a declaration spoken in silence. The next morning the forge was gone. Some said the militia burned it, others that the fire came from within. The folklore says Elias walked into the flames and vanished, leaving behind the shape of his chains melted into a single iron ring. For generations, people swore that ring still lay buried beneath the soil, humming faintly when thunder passed overhead. The militia's version of events ends bluntly: property damage only, no casualties. Yet even in their own report, the language stumbles: no casualties, followed by unidentified remains near River Bend. The handwriting changes halfway down the page, the ink lighter, the tone unsteady. It's the kind of inconsistency archivists call administrative error. But sometimes error is another word for fear. Sometimes what couldn't be written had to be disguised as incompetence. That same week, plantation owners in neighboring counties began fortifying their forges. Chains were locked up, firewood counted, songs forbidden. An overseer in Goochland writes, "Even the metal feels uneasy. The sound of the hammer breeds disquiet. How does one record fear in an official tone? They tried awkwardly, but every factual line reads like confession. Beneath the language of control lies panic, the kind that knows something invisible is spreading." Folklore took what fear erased and gave it shape. In the stories told by freed families, the night of the forge was not the end but the beginning. They called it the night of cooling iron. The old people said that if you placed a piece of raw metal in the fire that night, it wouldn't heat, as if the spirit of Elias had stolen the flame to keep it safe. It's a strange inversion, the fire that freed the heat that protected itself. Even myth obeys its own kind of truth. For the enslaved, rebellion didn't always mean blood. It meant refusal, patience, endurance, the kind of resistance that looked like work but wasn't. They knew how to make obedience appear convincing. A lowered head, a slower strike, a missing spark. The rebellion the state feared was not the one that shouted, but the one that waited. And so Elias's story became a warning disguised as legend. You cannot chain what has learned to wait. Later that autumn, a reverend named Thomas Blanks recorded a sermon referencing the blacksmith's fire as a temptation of the devil. In his words, "The forge is not the Lord's house. Its flame deceives." The sermon was copied, circulated, read aloud in neighboring parishes. But each retelling only strengthened the myth. The more they warned against it, the more people believed in it. Suppression breeds endurance. The attempt to erase gave birth to the eternal echo. One of the last mentions of the event appears in a ledger from the governor's office: confiscated goods, anvil, tongs, remnants of melted iron. No location, no owner, no follow-up. It's filed beside records of confiscated weapons. To the state, even a hammer could be treason. That detail matters because it reveals how deeply fear had seeped into governance. They were no longer fighting men, they were fighting symbols. By the time the year closed, the law had changed again. The assembly prohibited enslaved people from working as smiths or coopers without direct oversight. What began as rumor had become legislation. Every forge, every spark, every hammer strike now required the presence of whiteness to be considered safe. Yet even under supervision, the songs survived. They hummed beneath the rhythm of labor in the spaces between blows. Historians sometimes ask why no uprising followed Gabriel's failure, but perhaps the answer is simpler. Rebellion is not always visible. Sometimes it's a man refusing to strike iron on command. Sometimes it's a song mistaken for work. Sometimes it's silence, the most dangerous act of all. And so the facts and folklore converge again. The record says the forge was extinguished. The people say it never went out. In truth, both are right. The fire died in one world and lived on in another. The rebellion they hid was not a battle, but a transformation from flesh to flame, from man to myth, from sound to silence. By 1801, the fire at Deep Run Creek had become less a case and more a rumor. The archives move on, new plantations rise, new owners sign their ledgers, and the forges are rebuilt elsewhere. But the air in Henrico seems changed, quieter, heavier. Local records mention no further disturbances yet. Militia patrols double, and preachers begin their sermons with prayers against the temptation of flame. It's the kind of vigilance born not from law but from superstition. Even those who denied the story feared it all the same. In an overlooked appendix to the 1802 Council minutes, a brief statement appears. Several sites of prior labor have been found unfit for rebuilding due to soil condition and unexplained magnetism. The term magnetism feels out of place in a report about enslaved artisans. But it suggests that compasses failed near the site, that iron behaved strangely, that something in the ground resisted order. Science and fear often overlap in the record. Both are languages for what we cannot explain. One letter from a traveling surveyor mentions visiting a burnt forge by the creek. He writes, "The ground sings when struck with rod. The vibration is unnatural. No one followed up." The correspondence ends abruptly, as if the event itself refused to stay documented. It's one of those entries that historians find and hesitate over, too odd to include, too vivid to forget. Meanwhile, the oral stories evolve. In the decades that follow, freed families tell of the hum beneath the earth. Children are warned not to linger near the creek after dusk, lest they hear the anvil calling names. Some say the humming stops when you speak Elias's name. Others say it grows louder. For them, the forge had become both grave and altar, the place where a man turned into something unending. Spiritual songs from the Reconstruction era preserve echoes of that myth. A hymn recorded in 1871 includes the refrain, "The fire don't sleep, it wait." Musicologists assume it refers to divine judgment. But within the black community of Central Virginia, the phrase carried another meaning, the fire as memory, as witness. Elias's story had merged with biblical imagery, transforming rebellion into revelation. A Freedmen's Bureau report from 1866, more than 60 years later, lists a blacksmith shop rebuilt on old ground, cursed by rumor. The superintendent writes, "Workers refuse to labor there after sundown. No cause is given, only a final line, fire in the soil," a phrase repeated in 3 separate reports across the region. For an agency devoted to reconstruction and rationality, those words feel almost confessional. The folklore layer deepens here, becoming both survival and scripture. By the late 19th century, storytellers no longer spoke of Elias as man or ghost, but as the hammer itself. He appears in folk tales as a presence that tests the living a sound before storms a heat in the chest when someone lies. One tale tells of a blacksmith apprentice who bragged about beating his master's record. That night, the hammer struck 12 times by itself. When the boy returned, the tools were glowing cold. He learned respect, the elder said. The dead still teach. It's difficult to know where these stories end and memory begins. A field researcher in 1938 noted that no one wanted to say the name Elias out loud inside a forge. They believed it would cause the metal to crack. He described one worker whispering, "You can call the hammer, but don't call the hand. Even belief has boundaries. Reverence is just fear turned inward." The state, for its part, did not forget either. Decades after the event, laws remained that limited blacksmiths' independence. In 1831, following Nat Turner's uprising, Virginia reinforced its prohibition on enslaved artisans working without supervision. The preamble cites past acts of resistance involving skilled labor. It doesn't name Henrico, but the language fire meeting tools used with intent mirrors the old militia reports. History erases with one hand and quotes itself with the other. Among church documents, a curious pattern emerges. Baptismal records from several black congregations include converts listed as Elias Reborn, or Child of the Forge. The clergy likely saw it as metaphor, the idea of being remade by faith. But to those who carried the story, it was homage. The forge had become a symbol of transformation, the fire the passage. In the WPA oral archives, the story resurfaces under new shapes. One narrator calls Elias the man who built the sound. Another calls him the one who never cooled. In both, his defiance becomes prophecy. He taught us, one woman says that work could be worship and worship could be war. When the interviewer asked if she meant real war, she shook her head. No, baby, she said, the kind that happened in the heart. The folklore shifts from physical rebellion to moral endurance. The fire that once burned a forge now burns inside people. That is how trauma becomes theology through retelling. The legend teaches that oppression cannot be undone by violence alone, but by memory that refuses to fade. Every repetition of the story becomes a ritual, a way to keep the heat alive without letting it consume. Fact and folklore begin to trade places. The official records grow poetic. The oral accounts grow precise. One WPA transcription includes a map sketched by a local preacher marking where the earth won't cool. The coordinates correspond to the area once known as Deep Run Creek. Nearby, a modern soil analysis confirms unusually high iron content and magnetic activity. The intersection of myth and measurement becomes impossible to dismiss. From a scholarly perspective, such convergence demands restraint. Historians resist the temptation to call it proof. But folklore, older and wiser, smiles at the need for proof. It doesn't ask to be believed, only to be remembered. Fire don't prove itself, an elder told a field worker. You just feel it. Through the 20th century, descendants continued to visit the site on anniversaries. They brought nails, hammers, bits of scrap metal, offerings in a sense. They said it wasn't worship, it was gratitude. He showed us how to shape the heat, one said, and how to walk away from the fire without fear. The rituals blurred into memorials, the memorials into silence, and the silence into everyday resilience. By the 1940s, the legend of the blacksmith had spread beyond Virginia. Folklorists traced versions in North Carolina, Tennessee, even as far as Arkansas. The story changed, but the structure stayed the same: a forge, a fire, a man who refused. Each new version added a detail, a blue flame, an iron prayer, a hammer that sings. Myths travel like rivers. They erode the edges but keep the current. Modern historians debate whether Elias ever lived, but within black communities the question feels irrelevant. The story's truth is not biographical, it's spiritual. It represents a law older than nations that anything made by the oppressed will one day unmake oppression itself. The forge, then, is not history. It is prophecy folded into metal, waiting for someone to heat it again. The last document we have from the 19th century comes from a preacher's journal in 1899. Visited the river bend. Soil red. Air quiet. Heard sound like breath in the wind. Left nail in ground for peace. No context. No signature. Just a final note written in faith or fear that the story still listens. By the end of the century, the forge had vanished from every map but not from memory. The official reports ended in ash and redacted lines, yet the stories persisted quiet and steady like a pulse under soil. The blacksmith's name dissolved into echo until no one could say for certain if Elias was man-myth or both. But the question itself became irrelevant, because the fire, his fire, had outlived him. And now, after 200 years, the only thing left to burn was the silence that tried to bury it. When modern researchers returned to Deep Run Creek in 1937, the ground still held its hum. The instruments couldn't explain it. The magnetometers quivered. Compasses leaned toward the water. The archivist laughed half uneasy and wrote in the margin residual interference near former forge site. But one of them, a quiet man named Dr. William Kerr, added another note in handwriting, smaller, shakier, almost embarrassed. Sound of breath beneath wind cannot locate source. The file stops there. In folklore, this is the moment the story folds in on itself. The listener becomes the witness. The forge once destroyed becomes the archive. The earth that swallowed Elias becomes the memory that refuses decay. They say his final act wasn't rebellion, but transformation, not escape, but merging. That night, as the hammer struck 12 times, he was said to have spoken, "If I can't leave, I will stay as fire." And so he did. The fact layer falters here. The ink hesitates. A final military report lists unidentifiable residue, metallic and organic in nature. The tone, unusually human for a document of discipline, admits uncertainty. Remains do not conform to expectation. To those who read between lines, that means they didn't find a body. Only melted iron fused to the shape of a rib cage. The handwriting trails off midword, and the clerk never wrote another entry. In folklore, that same detail becomes resurrection. He melted himself free, they say. He became what he worked. The tale passes from forge to forge, carried by men who make tools, fences, weapons, men whose work depends on heat and patience. They whisper his name before lighting the fire, not as prayer, but as permission. For them, Elias is the forge's first ancestor, the man who proved that even labor could defy its purpose. The moment of transformation is told differently by each mouth. Some say the blue fire rose from the earth like breath from a sleeping giant. Others say the sky bent low, reflecting the color of his will. But every version ends the same, with silence so deep it hums. The hammer strikes once more, then stops. The flame, they say, keeps its shape long after the man is gone. For decades afterward, no one rebuilt on that soil. Even when offered free labor and timber, the overseers declined. They claimed it was cursed ground, but the truth is simpler. They were afraid of what might rise again. Fire is easy to extinguish. Memory isn't. Once the heat of defiance touches earth, it spreads in ways no water can reach. The clergy who preached against him gave up by 1810. In their own journals, they began to describe dreams of a man at an anvil who will not stop working. One writes, "I wake to the sound of hammering, though my forge is cold." The entry ends with a single word, "unforgiven." Even faith began to bend beneath the weight of his echo. The sinner they condemned became the saint they couldn't silence. The deeper the archives dig, the more the evidence begins to feel like prayer. Fragments of hymns, lines in letters, sketches of fire where words should be. Scholars of African American folklore call this residual resistance history embedded in behavior. The act of recording becomes the act of worship. The act of survival becomes the rewriting of creation itself. And then there is the silence, the kind that feels deliberate, the kind that stops the reader mid-page. The final page of the 1800 militia ledger contains a blot of ink, no text, as though the writer dipped his quill, began to speak, and thought better of it. That smudge is the bridge between worlds, where truth knows it has gone too far for safety and myth takes its place to carry the rest. Folklore takes over completely after that. The old people say the hammer still moves at midnight on certain anniversaries. They say if you stand close enough, you can hear the metal cooling the hiss like a sigh. A story that repeats for generations becomes indistinguishable from the faith it creates. The forge is gone, but its sound remains, teaching those who listen that every silence is built from something that once refused to stay quiet. The descendants who return each year call it the listening. They gather near the creek with lanterns and nails, pressing each one into the dirt. They don't speak his name aloud, but they hum the rhythm 12 beats slow and sure. Children fall asleep on the grass. Elders whisper prayers for strength. Some swear the ground warms beneath their palms. The ritual is small, but it is enough. The forge breathes through them. Fact can measure temperature, magnetic interference, vibration. It can catalog soil samples and chemical traces. But folklore measures something else: continuity. It asks only whether the story still works, whether it still transforms fear into memory, labor into defiance, suffering into art. By that measure, Elias never died. He multiplied. One modern historian tried to write a final account closing the case. He visited the site, took photos, recorded readings. His last note in the field log reads, "No anomalies detected. But I left feeling watched." That sentence, so small, says everything history cannot. Because what haunts is not the fire. It's the way the story looks back at those who read it. At some point, the line between storyteller and listener dissolves. To read the record is to strike the hammer again. To repeat his name is to feed the flame. That is why the story endures, because each retelling is another act of rebellion. Each time someone asks if it really happened, the heat rises a little more. And so the narrative folds into itself. The archive becomes the forge. The reader becomes the blacksmith. The act of remembering becomes the sound of striking iron. That is the climax, not an explosion, not a scream, but a recognition that the rebellion they hid was never about escape. It was about endurance. When the last document ends, it does so without punctuation. A half line, a breath caught mid-thought. The forge. Then nothing. No signature, no date. Just white space like smoke after lightning. The kind of ending that isn't an ending at all, but a silence waiting for someone else to continue the work. When the dust finally settled over the centuries, what remained of Elias's story was not a record, but a rhythm. The hammer's echo outlived every witness. The forge turned to earth, the earth to archive, and the archive to silence. Yet silence is never empty. It carries the shape of what once filled it. That is what makes this story impossible to close. The rebellion they hid did not end in smoke. It diffused into breath. It became the unseen pulse of a people learning to live beneath their own history. In the modern archives of Virginia, the file labeled Blacksmith Henrico 1800 still exists. A thin folder fewer than 20 pages tucked between agricultural reports. Most of its contents are reproductions, photocopies of letters, lists, fragments too fragile to handle. But on the back of the final page, written in faint pencil, is one last note, possibly connected to lost oral record. No name, no date. Someone long after tried to reconnect the halves, fact reaching toward folklore, as if realizing too late that both were needed. Scholars who study these gaps call them echo points, places where evidence ends and imagination begins. In African American history, those points are everywhere, not as errors, but as testaments. Each silence marks survival. Each omission means someone chose not to destroy everything. The space between truth and myth becomes the breath between strikes, the pause that keeps the rhythm alive. In interviews conducted during the 1940s, elders from Richmond still spoke of the hum in the soil. Some said it was only wind through the pines. Others said it was the sound of the past keeping count. You can't plow where fire remembers, one man told a historian. The ground still knows what it held. Such words blur the border between science and prayer, but perhaps that is the point. In the end, the past doesn't ask to be explained, only acknowledged. There are moments in archival research when the work feels less like reading and more like listening. You lean closer to faded ink and think you hear a voice. Maybe it's just the paper creaking under its own age. Maybe it's something else, something that refuses erasure. For every burned document, there's a story that outlived the fire by changing its shape. The Blacksmith's Tale is one of those stories too alive to die, too quiet to be safe. Even today, descendants in central Virginia keep the ritual alive. They visit the old creek each spring carrying small nails, pieces of scrap metal, or charms shaped like anvils. They press them into the dirt and hum 12 slow beats, a sound halfway between a song and a memory. No one calls it worship. No one calls it history. It is both. It is neither. It is continuity, the art of remembering without proof. Historians continue to debate the event's authenticity. Was Elias a real man or an invention of collective grief? Did the forge truly burn, or was it an allegory of resistance passed from mouth to mouth? But the debate itself becomes part of the story, because the need to ask proves that something was felt. Something existed strongly enough to demand explanation. And that is how folklore wins, by making doubt its evidence. Modern science may call it coincidence, but in oral tradition, coincidence is just another name for return. When the wind shifts over the old creek, the trees creak in rhythm, slow, metallic, deliberate. People who live nearby say it sounds like hammering. They don't look for reasons anymore. They've learned that not everything that rings needs to be measured. Some sounds belong only to memory. To the people who still tell his story, Elias is not gone. He is process. He is the motion of making the rhythm of persistence, the heat beneath exhaustion. He exists in every hand that bends metal, in every craftsman who works between obedience and freedom. His rebellion was not fire against masters, it was the refusal to cool. That refusal became inheritance passed quietly through generations until it no longer needed words. In the archives, you can feel where the record ends. The temperature of the page seems to change. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's the same warmth that's been waiting 2 centuries for recognition. When the last line fades, it does so without conclusion. The reader is left holding the weight of what can't be proven but won't be forgotten. The heat remains faint but steady, like iron that has decided to glow forever. Some stories are too exact to be myths and too miraculous to be facts. This is one of them. It belongs to that in-between place where scholarship meets faith, where the measurable and the mystical hold hands. It is the story of creation through defiance of a man who refused to let work mean obedience, who turned his forge into a sanctuary. In that way, Elias still works, not in flame, but in the persistence of remembering. Each time his name is spoken, the hammer lifts again. Each time someone says the word freedom with heat in their throat, the forge relights itself for an instant. The rebellion never ended. It only learned to take new forms. When we close this file, we do so knowing it can't truly be closed. The hum in the soil is proof enough. The echo remains underfoot, moving with every heartbeat that listens long enough to hear it. The story does not ask for belief, only that we keep the silence warm. What if both truth and myth were needed to survive? You've just heard a file from history that never truly closed.